Loud. Okay, well, welcome everyone. Um, my name is Trevor Scott, and I'm the director of the Forum, Jesuit Forum, based in Toronto. And it's good to have you here. We're a small group, and people may join us gradually, more people. But we're here to focus on and cherish, I think is a good word, Mary Jo Leddy, her book, Why Are We Here? A Meditation on Canada, which was published in 2019. So it's not a new book, but we felt at the forum that it's worth, if you haven't already read it, it's worth being reintroduced to, because particularly in the climate in which we're finding ourselves, um, looking at our Canadian identity in a new way and a surprising way too. But we'll say more about that in a moment. And just to say, we were going to have Mary Jo Leddy here with us, along with Stephen Scharper. But Mary Jo Leddy is battling a flu, so she didn't feel that she could be here to join us. And then all the planning that would have been involved in her being with us. So she passed it on to Stephen, and Stephen Scharper, I'll introduce in a moment, has gratefully, we're grateful to have him with us to reflect upon Mary Jo Leddy's book, Why Are We Here? So, yeah, yes,
No,
that's right.
that's right.
It was going to be a team effort, but now you're at that. So just begin with the land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge this land on which the Jesuit Forum operates, and what is known as commonly known as Toronto, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So we're just carefully mindful that of the land on which we live and we call home, with a sense of gratitude. And just, you can silent it yourself, just acknowledge the land on which you call home, or to share aloud. So this is the beginning of a series that the Forum decided to embark upon, of a reading series, for lack of a better term, a book club, although we didn't want to call it a book club. And we thought we would start with Mary Jo Leddy's book, Why Are We Here? Meditation on Canada. And I could say a few words about the other sections we'll have in this reading forum series at the conclusion, if you're interested. I'm sure you got messages about them. And we just thought it would be a good way to, they're reflecting on books, not necessarily new books that have been published a few years ago, but on a socially relevant theme that we thought would be a lot of interest, and people would welcome the opportunity for meaningful discussion around on certain issues such as our Canadian identity, but also on our ecological relationships, on our relationships with Indigenous peoples in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, and just in general, looking at Catholic social teaching and how different Christians, and Catholics in particular, have striven to act upon and live out our Catholic social teachings in our world today. And so, but we thought we would start with Mary Jo Leddy's book, Why Are We Here? Many of you may know of Mary Jo Leddy, if you don't know her personally. In the 1960s, she joined the Congregation of Our Lady of Zion from the prairies. She's from the prairies. And it's Our Lady of Zion was a Roman Catholic religious order aimed at fostering Jewish-Christian relations. And she completed her PhD in 1980 at the University of Toronto, focusing on the Holocaust. And then in 1991, while on the board of the Catholic New Times, a publication which she was a founding editor of, she helped found Romero House. It's a Toronto home for refugees, and which she's still the director of, and it's still going strong to this day. In 94, she left her congregation of Our Lady of Zion, explaining that it was with Romero House that she felt her true vocation lie. So Mary Jo Leddy is not only the director of Romero House, she actually lives at Romero House ever since all these years. And in their intervening years, she has taught theology at Regis College, which is part of the University of Toronto, and exploring themes in her books, such as gratitude, the other face, the role of newcomers in bringing us to a deeper knowledge of Christ. And most recently, this book that we're focusing on now, Why Are We Here? And she said a few years ago about refugees drawn to Canada, what attracted newcomers to Canada. She said, I think that any of us that are involved in social justice work have a lot to complain about this country. I think right now about the Indigenous peoples and their struggle for a measure of justice and respect. We have a long way to go on a lot of things, but I do treasure the basic insight of refugees, that this is a place where you can hope. And it's very touching to me. I think most of them, regardless of negative experiences, even negative experiences of racism, they really still say this is the best country in the world to be in. And that's a bit shocking to me, she says. And it's an important shock. I take this country so for granted, as I think many of us do. And that's sad. We should never take it for granted. And then when she was asked in an interview in the Anglican Journal a few years ago, before the book was published, why she wrote Why Are We Here? She responded, I quote, many years ago, I was the editor of an independent Catholic newspaper with a focus on social justice. And through that work, I became very aware of liberation theology in Latin America and how powerful that was. When people began to think and pray in ways that were coherent within their context. She says, I realized that while I was writing about the Latin American context and the theology that grew up there, I had no real articulation of my own context, which was Canada. And I began to wonder why that was so. He says in the same interview, as Canadians, we think our context is boring, not of great interest, not as interesting as Latin America or Europe. And I began to see that is what happens when you live in a colonial context. And Canada has always been a colony of France, of England, of the United States. You always think about what's happening elsewhere, how it affects you, what it means, and you have no real insight into the here. And as I began to ask that question, I really began to read books on Canadian culture, Canadian literature, and began to teach courses on this. And I knew the students found it helpful. It shaped the way I was beginning to look at what I was doing. And Michael Swan in the Catholic Register at the same time wrote when Why Are We Here was released. He said, we can try to freeze our country in a gauzy past before we are hit with a maelstrom of cultural and economic change. Or we can find a willingness to see Canada constantly becoming something new. Refugees and immigration, more generally, are just one of the forces remaking Canada right now. but Mary Jo Leddy is concerned with a much deeper dynamic. If we don't know what we're for as a country, we are going to define ourselves by what and who we are against, she said. She continues in conversation with Michael Swan. We have lots of examples of politicians and groups that, because they lack a positive sense of purpose, choose to define themselves by an enemy. That kind of public debate isn't just about refugees. It's about who we are as a country. I'm suggesting that it's helpful to go back to the origins of this particular country and ask ourselves, what has happened? And Michael Swan then says, by going back, Leddy means something more profound than hitting the history books. She urges us to get out of our apartments and houses, out of our suburbs and cities. She wants us out in the country, getting a feel for the rocks and trees and lakes and coastlines of our nation. A feel for the special place we know of as Canada, with the perspective of new eyes, the eyes of the newcomer. Canada offers freedom. The land itself is free, wild, and open to possibility. But at the same time, she urges us to, quote, imitate and reverence Indigenous connection to the land. Canadians of all stripes are going to have to discover their own connection with the place they call home. And that reminded me of Robin Wall Kimmerer and what she said about the newcomer plant known as white man's footsteps, or white man's footstep, which is not native to North America, Turtle Island. Robin Wall Kimmerer said, this wise and generous plant, the white man's footstep, faithfully following the people, became an honored member of the plant community. It's a foreigner, an immigrant. But after 500 years of living as a good neighbor, people forget that kind of thing. Robin Wall Kimmerer further says, being naturalized to place means to live as if this is the land that feeds you, as if these are the streams from which you drink, that build your body and fill your spirit. To become naturalized is to know that your ancestors lie in this ground. Here you will give your gifts and meet your responsibilities. So that's just a little bit of an introduction. And now I will ask Stephen to continue with on how we can more deeply appreciate Mary Jo Leddy's thoughts in this book. But just a brief introduction of Stephen. He's associate professor of the School of the Environment and the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. And he's the author of a few books, one called For Earth's Sake, Toward a Compassionate Ecology, that explores the notion of how we are being called to develop a loving relationship with the world in light of contemporary ecological challenges. And he's also edited a book called The Natural City, Re-envisioning Human Settlements, and wrote Redeeming the Time, a Political Theology of, and most recently, The Green Bible, Words of Hope for a Suffering World, that he co-wrote with Simon Apolloni. Stephen is a commentator on various news outlets, writes for the Toronto Star and other publications. He's been on TV Ontario, CTV News, City Pulse, and so on. So he's quite well known, especially in ecological circles, and but not only limited to that. So, Stephen, we're really glad for you to be able to join us and help us more deeply appreciate Mary Jo Leddy's Why Are We Here?
Oh, thanks so much, Trevor. And it's great to be with you all. Thank you for joining.
Mm.
And what a What a wonderful moment just to kind of reflect on Mary Jo, her writing and her presence. And she sends her love to you all and is sorry that she can't be here. And I thought I'd begin with a story about Mary Jo and myself. So back in the early 80s, I was at St. Michael's College at U of T. I was an undergrad, and I had co-edited the newspaper, The Mike, for St. Mike's. And I was very impressed with this newspaper, the Catholic New Times newspaper, because it took a social justice aspect to our faith and looked at contemporary issues of liberation, struggles, etc. So I wanted a summer job in Toronto. So I decided I would just call the Catholic New Times and see if they had a job. So I called, spoke to an anonymous person, and I said, do you have any summer openings? And they said, no. And I said, okay. They said, but just leave your phone number. So I left my phone number. Well, 2 weeks later, I get a call from Mary Jo Leddy. She said, hi, this is Mary Jo. I'm going away this summer because I have to finish my PhD dissertation. We're looking for an editor. So why don't you come on Monday for an interview? So I put together a little packet and I went down to the St. Paul's School where Catholic New Times was housed and slipped my little portfolio under the door. And then I went at 2 o'clock on that Monday for an interview with Mary Jo Leddy. And she said, Steve, I've vetted you. I've called your references. I've looked at, you have the job. And here's what it is. So I always tell my students, never underestimate the power of cold calls.
Mm-hmm.
But it has been a lifelong relationship of friendship, of mentorship, of spiritual direction. A few years later, as Trevor mentioned, she was part of the Sisters of Zion. She was asked to go on a fact-finding trip to Israel and occupied Lebanon during the Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon in the early 80s. And they said, you can go, but you have to bring a male who is 6 feet tall or taller. So she asked me to go with her. And so we went, and that was fascinating. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, Mary Jo has a coolness under fire. And she kept her calm, even in war zones. But I'll tell you one other story that struck me as interesting. So we're in the northernmost part of Israel before going into occupied Lebanon, where we're meeting an Israeli military contingent, and we have to sign a waiver form. And this is a very detailed waiver form because you're going into a war zone. And they're very specific. You could lose an eye, you could lose your left toe, you could lose your larynx, you could. And Mary Jo's just having coffee and just signing it. And I said, Mary Jo, did you see this about like losing both legs? She was like, but we went. And it was on that trip that I really got to know and deeply respect and love Mary Jo, not just as a mentor, but almost like an older sister and someone who was so down to earth and so grounded and so spiritually generous that she continues to this day to just be an inspiration and a dear friend. My wife and I also have worked on the US-Mexico border with refugees. And my wife, Hillary Cunningham, is the author of a book called God and Caesar at the Rio Grande, Sanctuary and the Politics of Religion. So we were able to help Mary Jo connect with the sanctuary community of Tucson, Arizona, and that has led to remarkable, wonderful connections and friendships. And Mary Jo is beloved there as well, along that US-Mexico border with all the people who are helping refugees and migrants. She is well known to them and well loved. So it's a real honor to be here to talk a little bit about this book. When I first started working at the Catholic New Times and talking to Mary Jo in 1980, she was talking about the ideas that are now expressed in this book. As the material that Trevor helpfully provided intimates, she was very interested in what a native, indigenous, quote unquote, autochthonous Canadian liberation theology would be like. We were looking at the important and transformative work of Gustavo Gutierrez of Peru and John Sobrino, the Jesuit of El Salvador, theologians who were helping the world understand that to know God has to involve the doing of justice, and that the preferential option for the poor is not just something that would be desirable in the fullness of time, but necessary now, in this time. And she began to reflect years ago on what would a Canadian theology of liberation look like. So this book is really in gestation for decades. She was also part of a colloquy. She called a number of people together from around Canada, and we met in British Columbia to go over this preliminary draft of the book, where she wanted ideas from people across the spectrum: farmers, organic farmers, activists, faith leaders, regular folks who had a stake in the future of Canada. And it was a privilege to be part of those conversations. And Mary Jo wanted that kind of reflection from that grouping to be part of this book. So all of that is poured into what we see now in this particular title. And in order to kind of provide a little way into the title of this book, what are we doing here? And I wanted to do a little reflection with you, a little time travel, if I may. And for those of us in Ontario, it's not that far, but we're going back in time about 200 years to the shores of Lake Ontario, into a little community called York, now known as Toronto. And we hear a sound constantly, day and night. It's not the sound of lake water lapping on the shore, but of wind blowing through the old growth climax Maple Beach forest that goes north to the Cambrian Shield, east to the Ottawa Valley, west to present-day Windsor, Ontario, and beyond. It's a vast, deep, dark forest. And some of us write about it in our journals. For some, this is a thrilling sound. But for many, it's deeply disturbing. It reminds us of our tempest-tossed crossing from the old world to the new. Today, 95% of that forest has been cut down, and the 5% that remains stands in jeopardy. This is a wind gone with the forest. I now invite you to fast forward in time, but not to the present, but to your past, and to a place in your childhood in Canada where you could find your thoughts and yourself in nature, a place in nature where you could come to your senses as a young person. Could be a garden, a backyard, a lake, a cottage. Put yourself there now. Does that place still exist? If so, how is it preserved? If not, what's happened to it? Has it been bulldozed into a shopping mall, transformed into a condominium complex, paved over into a parking lot? If so, how did such quote unquote development make you feel? Did you chalk it up to the inexorable march of progress? Or did you see it as a body blow to your spirit? And if you did see it as a spiritual loss, perhaps we all have a sense of what Indigenous peoples of this country felt when their sacred lands were taken from them and developed. And if we did see it as a spiritual loss, I think we're sensing what Mary Jo is talking about when she poses the question to us that was raised by an Indigenous confronting an arrival from another place. Why are we here? What are we doing here? What's our connection to the land? What are our spiritual roots in Canada, from our faith traditions, in our present moment? As Trevor mentioned, I teach environmental studies here at the University of Toronto. and have kind of waded through the waters of religion and ecology and spirituality. And I've tried to kind of bridge conversations between liberation theology of Gustavo Gutierrez, John Sobrino, and many, many others since, and the new cosmology of Thomas Berry, Brian Swim, and others who look at the expansion of the universe as a horizon of ecological action. So finding where the stars meet the street, in other words, where do they meet? In Mary Jo's book, we find the evolution of her thinking from a liberationist perspective, a social activist, peace activist perspective. And Mary Jo, as many of you know, was very involved in the anti-nuclear peace movement of the 1980s. She led a delegation to the former Soviet Union on a peace mission. She stood and was a protester at Lytton Industries, north of Toronto. And Lytton was making the cruise missile guidance systems at that time for the United States. She has been on the front lines of peace activism and a compassionate Canada all her adult life. But when a refugee knocked at her door with no place to go, she had to respond. And she began to answer the question, I think, why am I here? I am here to welcome the stranger. I am here to offer loving space to those people who have no loving spaces. As she began to reflect on the land in her studies for this book, she realized how important the land was in grounding not only the Canadian identity and people within Canada who had been born and raised here, but for refugees whom she had helped through Romero House. Mary Jo established Sanctuary North. This is on Manitoulin Island, north of the Bruce Saugeen Peninsula in Georgian Bay. And there she takes refugees with their children in the summers. And she describes beautiful stories of the delight of kids jumping off 10-foot cliffs into the waters of Manitoulin, but also of refugees who had been in the kind of urban, dank environs of Toronto, who go to this beautiful spot in Ontario and they say, now I feel like I'm in Canada. Now I feel like I'm home. This reminds me of the mountains at home. This reminds me of the spaces I was before. This reminds me of the beauty of my home country. And I've talked to some of these refugees who Mary Jo has brought to Sanctuary North. And they have expressed the same thing. That's when I felt I was in Canada. That the land there, the beauty of that land and the free expression of their joy within that land was when they felt they were Canadian, on Canadian soil, in the Canadian context. And this idea pulsates through Mary Jo's writing, I think. The power of our geography, the power of our land to ground us, to shape us, and then the commitment we have to protect this land, to protect this territory. I teach a graduate course here at U of T on ecological worldviews. And I had a guest speaker this week named Tim Leduc, beautiful man, who teaches social work and Indigenous studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. And he's done a lot of work on spirituality and decolonization. But he said in this moment, when we have the President of the United States saying that the line that separates Canada from the United States is an artificial one, and that we are somehow the 51st state, and that our prime minister is merely a governor and not a head of state, not a sovereign leader. He says this is an opportunity to understand what many indigenous have felt when their sovereign leaders were denigrated and when their territory was considered artificial. This is a special moment of solidarity with the land, with the indigenous peoples and people around the world who have been colonized by aggressive and, dare I say, tyrannical forces. Mary Jo's work to me is more relevant now than when it came out in 2019, and will continue to be relevant as we deal with the current crisis facing us with our former ally to the south. Mary Jo had written about this after the Free Trade Accord was signed. And some of you may remember the debate between John Turner and Brian Mulroney. And Brian Mulroney, as supporter of the Free Trade Agreement, was critiqued by the former Prime Minister John Turner, who said, "You have just prepared us to become the 51st state. And you will become the first governor of the 51st state, because it begins with economic domination and then ends with political colonization." At that time, Mary Jo was reflecting and working on this idea of deep integration between the United States and Canada that certain think tanks and politicians in the United States were talking about, how we needed deep integration between the US and Canada. And she was very worried about Canada's sovereignty then. Part of what I think she's inviting us to reflect on in this book is, what do we love here in Canada? Is our land acknowledgement an acknowledgement of our rootedness in and dependence on the earth, on this land, and on the traditions that we've established, on the democracy we've fashioned, warts and all? What is the role of our spiritual connection and our love for our identity as Canadians on this land? And might those provide wellsprings for a future of strength, independence, and a further deepening of our democratic values? In asking these questions, she's touching on deep reflection in environmental studies, ontology, and the philosophy of being, and how our identity is rooted in land, in the soil, and the importance of soil, the importance of the more than human world for centering us as people. As you know, when Mr. Trump was campaigning for the presidency, in addition to saying he would be dictator on day one, his other mandate was to drill, drill, drill. That this assault on the earth was priority number one. And as you know, there is now great interest in cutting down the forests in the national forests and in national parks, places that were preserved for future generations and for the integrity of the earth. When Mary Jo in this book asks us to reflect on, what are we protecting here? What is our place here? Why are we here? Is it to protect our democracy, to promote the common good, to welcome the stranger, to have our love as, if we are Christian, our Christian love spill out into the common good? Is it also to preserve this land because of the role of the land in shaping our identity culturally, biologically, physically, and spiritually? If we destroy or lose our land, we become unliberated. And for me, I think that's part of the message that I glean from Mary Jo. But she always does this with humility, with self-critique, with joy and compassion. Every time I see Mary Jo, she laughs. Despite all the things that she has seen and all the things she's been part of, she laughs. She has a beautiful sense of humor, and that sense of joy, even though it's not in the book, is what I think she wants us to preserve. That is part of what gives life to us, that gives life to Canada, and to any free people. Because we are liberated when we can laugh and share in that joy with others. So, Trevor, I think I'll pause there and then we can segue to further conversation if that works on your end.
Sure. Thank you so much, Stephen. That was wonderful, really wonderful. Maybe I'll just give a couple of observation feedback or whatever, and then what jogged me, and then maybe a question or two, and then I'll open it up to everyone of what they've heard and how from you as well as the book. I was really struck by that image where the stars meet the street. I've never heard that term before, and it's just so powerfully evocative. And I recall I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, and I have family in Wawa, Ontario. So I go up every year to Lake Superior to go hiking, photographing. And in Lake Superior Provincial Park, it's a dark sky preserve. So, and I just, when I'm on Agawa Bay, the star, like I remember just on the beach looking up, and it's just, you could see the Milky Way. It's just the swirl. And I almost fell over because it was just, I kept, going, and I could see the highway in the distance when sometimes the transports, at night, and the stars literally cut through the horizon, and over the highway, and literally the stars are meeting the street, So it's and I was also really struck by um, uh, how this is the time in which we find ourselves with the threats that Donald Trump is making against our sovereignty, in essence. This is not an opportunity, but an opening for us to empathize with Indigenous peoples in the porousness of, in the worst sense of the term, boundaries, like almost the disrespect of what we call home. And I think this is a quote unquote opportunity for us to see with Indigenous eyes as much as we can in light of our present circumstances. And I do have a question regarding the text that you may be able to shed light on. And Mary Jo in chapter 4 in her book says, "For each of us, there's a challenge of finding our place. For us as a country, we may be on the cusp of finding our true place in the world. We may be on the cusp of finding our true place in the world. If there is such a thing as social conversion," she asks, "it would mean a change of us as a people, from taking this place for granted to treating it with a sense of gratitude." And my question is, in light of that, in our new relationship with, well, the United States, but with Trump in particular, I want to limit it to that because not all citizens of the United States think alike, of course. It's a very divided society. But in light of our new relationship that has emerged, are we on the cusp of losing our sense of place before we've actually found it? You know, Mary Jo was saying we're on the cusp of finding it, but now are we on the cusp of losing it? Or is these new circumstances a kind of a new way of, you know, God writes in crooked lines? I don't,
Yes.
um,
That's a great question, Trevor. And I was thinking, I'm so glad you mentioned that because I was thinking of something along those lines when I was listening to former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien at the Liberal convention.
mm,
And, you know, he spoke about some of the moments of Canadian independence from the United States. I mean, it was a rousing speech in many ways. But he also used this moment of to push for a pipeline, a gas pipeline that would go coast to coast. We all know about environmental hazards that go along with these kinds of pipelines and the environmental destruction that goes along with them. Saskatchewan, I understand the Prime Minister, the Premier Mo has said that he's already pre-approved any pipelines coming across Saskatchewan. So in light of your question, are we losing our sense of place before we find it? If the only takeaway from this threat to Canada is to develop our resources and destroy the beauty of this land that we are dependent on, and to ignore what we've learned in the last 50 years of ecological science, but also the wisdom that we're beginning to learn from Indigenous communities of our deep interrelationality with the land, then we do, in a sense, run the risk of losing our sense of place before we find it.
mhm,
There are alternative energy sources there.
mhm,
It doesn't have to be a green lighting of oil and gas industry exploiting as much as possible to be independent of the United States.
mhm,
That's destroying our home to preserve it. And more than that, as Mary Jo, I think, is intimating, that's destroying our sense of self, because our sense of self comes from the land. The land roots us culturally, spiritually, geographically, biologically. It's pretty basic. And when we kind of steamroll over that, we're in danger of losing our sense of place before we really find it.
mhm. Thank you, Stephen. Maybe if anyone else has a question or just share a thought. And I have other questions myself, but I don't want to hog the time.
I I don't know that I can add or pose questions because when I saw this posting for this session, I didn't even know it was a book study group. So I just came based on the theme at this time. And as someone who for, oh gosh, now I guess about almost 50 years have been feeling like I'm in this tug of war between I'll being pulled kicking and screaming to stay within a commitment to Catholicism against, you know, and lots of times it feels like against my better judgment, certainly against any of my peer groups. You know, I've felt very alone and in my search for a community within the Catholic sphere. And so it feels really quite moving to be with people with a common commitment. So I'm really grateful for that and loving this conversation. I grew up in the Northwest Territories before there was much there, and feel very connected to the land. My parents actually were from Toronto, and they made their way up north somehow, and big Catholic family in this small northern community. And I have those experiences, and I know, and also I went to a federal Indian day school, so I grew up knowing the issues. I grew up at a time where I could tell that something was missing when people weren't really allowed to practice their traditions. So I sort of feel like I come to all of this with a mixed bag, because I went to a federal Indian day school in Fort Smith, which is the school that Mark Carney's dad was the principal of,
Wow.
and also where a lot of leaders of the North came from. The Oblates had a school there where they were bringing kind of the progressiveness of the 60s into the North, and out of that came. So I have, a whole bunch of mixed things. I remember the racism of my town, all of that. And it's deeply embedded in me. My parents, our family adopted some kids, so I'm part of the, understand the 60s scoop thing, understand the loss of and grief and loss that comes with losing people to addictions. So it's, what can I say? One of the things that I've been trying to understand is how to weave that into my understanding of who that means for who I am in this time. And knowing that all of us here on the screen all have a different experience. And I taught immigrants in Vancouver about community development and community leadership. And I think, Stephen, you mentioned this as well in out of Mary Jo's book. They would say to me, can you teach us how to be Canadian? And I, can you actually, Canadian is always evolving and changing. So it's what we all continue to put into it. And so I guess I've really been grappling with a lot of these subjects, and I'm working on some writing of my own on, I'm a compassionate listener facilitator, and I've been wanting to help people imagine how they can listen with compassion to all that is in space and time, and to start to think about community differently rather than as what we are, how we typically think of community, but to start to think of it as all that is in space and time, and to look, how do we listen? How do we listen to our ancestors? How do we listen to the intergenerational trauma that many Canadians have felt, but most definitely Indigenous people? How do we listen to the plants and the trees? How do we listen to people around the world? How do we listen to future generations in every moment of our day? And so I'm super excited to be part of this, and it feels like it's exactly the kinds of conversations that I would love to be part of in some way. So I'm so grateful to be here with you and to hear these thoughts, and I'm frantically writing down books to read and such, and feeling like I've found some of my people. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for a beautiful reflection, and what a wonderful life way to be involved in compassionate listening. I really think this is among the most important horizons that we could all walk into, is how to be compassionate listeners. And I had mentioned earlier Thomas Berry. Some of you might have heard of Thomas Berry. He was a Roman Catholic priest, a Passionist priest, who also was a cultural historian. And he called himself a geologian, not a theologian. And he was an expert in Buddhism, and he read Sanskrit and Chinese as well as Latin. But his first ecological book was The Dream of the Earth. And I used to work in publishing. So I used to be at Orbis Books and then at Novalis. And while we were at Orbis Books, our editor-in-chief had tried to get Thomas to publish with us. And he said, well, you know, I would go for years to these conferences, and I'd go to the book tables, and I'd go to the publishers and said, the Catholic publishers, what do you have on the environment? And they're, well, nothing. And so for his first book on the environment, he went with Sierra Club books because Sierra Club had been committed to the environment. His influence has been very profound.
Mhm.
And he accents what you're talking about, the importance of listening. And he said, we've become deaf to the natural world. Like we've lost our interest in or ability to listen to the more than human world. And so he talks about, and Trevor, your beautiful description of the night sky in the north is just so compelling. And it reminds me of the kind of cosmological thrust of Thomas Berry's work, being in relationship to that awe and wonder as the beginning of religious experience. That awe and wonder and that ability to listen to the more than human world is so important, as it is to listen to each other. So how do we listen without immediately forming a comeback or, you know, forming impressions or, you know, think, oh, just listen and absorb that. And I'll just end here with a story about Thomas Berry. So he was invited to speak to a group of, this is a long time ago, a group of indigenous elders in what was known as Cape Croker, an indigenous Chippewa of Nawash Reserve on the Bruce Saugeen Peninsula near Tobermory, Ontario. And these were indigenous elders from across North America. Tom Porter from the Mohawk community, Oren Lyons, Danny Beaton, a Mohawk filmmaker, was there. And Tom was probably in his late 70s or 80s at the time. And before he went into this room, he was wondering, what can I tell these elders? And so he stood on the shores of Georgian Bay and he heard the waters lapping on the shore. And for him, the water said, tell them the story. And he heard the wind blowing through the trees. And the trees said, tell them the story. So he went back and he told them his understanding of the universe story, of the origin and progression of the universe as a spiritual journey and as essential for understanding our place here on Earth. And afterwards, Tom Porter comes up to him and says, Tom, we've all talked and we agree, you must have indigenous blood in you to tell us that story.
Mhm.
But it was through listening. And he was respected, even though he was a Catholic priest, and we know the history of Catholic missions and the underside. They respected him. And one of the reasons they respected him, according to this Mohawk filmmaker who was a friend of mine, said because he listened and he understood this deeper connection. He didn't come and preach, he listened. And I think there's a wonderful thrust in what you're doing, Kathleen. And I'm putting my email in the chat if you can see that. So I would love to continue the dialogue and be happy to talk about these ideas and whatever I can offer that might be helpful.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah.
Your story reminds me of a simple little one that I had on a much different level, but I had finished my master's in community development at the University of Calgary and went to my hometown in Fort Smith. I was, I went back to school late, and so I was older, but I was still new to my profession and went to a Friendship House meeting, and part of my role there was to support community development and research in the town. And so I, put on my new credentials and spoke like a community developer, planner person. And afterwards, this elder came up to me and said, when you come here, don't talk like that. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, how should I talk? And she said, just talk from your heart. And that is kind of formed the foundation of, things that I've taught in my courses is that we, coming from a Western worldview, trained in a Western worldview, we privilege this other knowledge. And so from that, we worked on how to support people to imagine knowledge as holistic, that Western knowledge is helpful, but it's not the thing, and it's from the heart is where it's got to land.
Yes. Well, thanks, Kathleen, for sharing that. It reminds me of another story of another Catholic priest, a Canadian, Father Rene Fumelot, who was, you probably knew Father Fumelot, and a beautiful person and a beautiful poet, a beautiful writer. But he told the story once at a book launch of one of his poems. When I was with Novals, we published one of his books of poetry, and he said he was a young oblate priest, and he went out, to the Dene in the West Coast, the Northwest Territories, or whatever. And he said, I was the most triumphalistic, bombastic bozo, and later, as you know, he became an amazing advocate for the Dene, particularly in their fight against the Mackenzie pipeline. And he translated the materials and helped negotiate the end of that. He became a deeply honored and venerable member, in a sense, of that community. And he went back to the elders and said, how did you stand me? I was coming out, and they just said, we knew you had potential.
Yeah.
Like they weren't judging him. There's no cancel culture. It's like, we know, well, we can work with this man. We see enough here. We knew you had potential. And it's just, to me, a beautiful story. Like, I mean, this is, but there's something here we can work with. We're not canceling him, we're embracing him and we'll work with him. And he was loved, and he did an amazing act of remarkable friendship, solidarity, and advocacy with the Dene, but always retained and nurtured those spiritual waters in him, in his poetry and his spiritual reflections and his humility and his ability to listen and be taught. I'm being evangelized here. I thought I knew it all. I guess I don't. Oh.
That is my experience in Indigenous communities. That's part of my experience. I don't think we should back away from the fact that there's a tremendous amount of trauma and victimization within communities and all of that. But I think that's got to be the focus, this wisdom that's inherently there deep within people. And I guess I've come to that's deep within all of us. And how do we find that, and how do we listen to our deepest self? And do we have time for me to share one little story from a community group?
Sure.
Yeah. So I taught these courses in neighborhood houses in Vancouver, and they were free for people from the community to come and participate. And it was at I guess I would call it a literacy level. And they were almost all newcomers to Canada who participated. And this one Chinese Canadian woman, not so much a newcomer, but she was part of the community, and she came and asked if she could participate, but she had taken time off work to help her elderly mother, who suffered from dementia, quite severe dementia. So she needed to be with her mom all the time. And so she wanted to take the course, and her question was, can I bring my mom? And this was a course, a college level course. And I was like, just trying to figure it out in my mind how this would work. And I went with yes, and we talked about how she could support her mom to participate and be happy, and me to teach. And then the woman said to me, but there's one thing you could do that would make my mom really happy. And so I asked her, and she said, my mom came to Canada in the 60s, part of that movement of people from China here. And they came because of Canada's multiculturalism policy. And she loved Canada. So now this woman has deep, deep, deep dementia. She doesn't remember anything, but she remembers how to play the harmonica. And she said, if you could let my mom play O Canada on the harmonica at the beginning of the class, that's all. She set her up for the day. So I did. I said, yeah, go for it. And she would play O Canada at the beginning of every class. And all of these other newcomers to Canada just had, and well, so me too, had tears pouring down our face of this elderly woman who had no memory except of inclusion in Canada. Maybe of her family, but very little memory left except of inclusion and what she loved about this country. And they all afterwards said, this is what Canada's about. So it made me try to imagine, what is that very deep memory we all have that we bring to who we are as Canadians, as newcomers to Canada, what do we bring from our countries? How do we locate that and offer it up as she did, and as a song?
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing that. That's
Yeah, it's a beautiful story.
poignant story. Beautiful.
I'm lucky I got through it without tears again.
Beautiful.
Maybe we could, Sister Marianne, I don't know if you're still, or Reed, if you have anything to offer or a question, or no pressure, but it's just,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, Reed.
Well, I grew up next to Cold Lake Indian Reserve in northern Alberta. Have you been there, Kathleen?
No, but I know of it, and I was thinking you're Ukrainian from Alberta, right?
I'm Polish, actually, and we're not the same.
Oh, I have a Polish daughter-in-law, so yeah, I do know that. Yeah.
But what I was aware of in my early days, I just flowed right into the colonial attitudes, and I didn't question why, all these wagons lined up at the farm instructor's place on a Sunday. And it was only later that I learned, like, they had to get permission from this white man up on the hill for almost everything that they wanted to do on their farm. And so just the experience of what our Indigenous people experienced helped me to question kids. And then we had these I used to do the retreat work, and we had these choices. What do you want most from other people? To be heard, to be respected, to make your own decisions. And I forgot the fourth one, but all of them were things that the Indigenous people did not experience. And so I think in reflecting on what I left behind, it really helped me to understand what is true of all our human desires. I think as a religious, I feel at this point, I don't know where to insert myself. I do the land acknowledgements and that sort of thing, but I don't feel comfortable initiating relationships with people that maybe don't want to be related, don't want to relate to me. That's one piece. I think I'll stop here. I didn't read the book. It's out of print and you can't get it online either. But I really love Mary Jo Leddy. I've had experiences with her over the years and the Catholic New Times. And then when I forgot the name of the reporter that worked with her on the papal visit to Canada. So I had some close encounters with her, and she is a very favorite human.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Beautiful. Mhm.
Just to put clarification, the book is in print. Like I think through our registration, we had a link to Novalis. They have copies. I don't know if Indigo would have, like a,
I called Indigo.
yeah, yeah, but
Indigo,
Novalis, yeah, no,
the Novalis has them. Okay, I didn't try that.
yeah, but good. Yeah, no, Sister Marianne, I know what you mean. I can, I'm a religious too. I'm a Jesuit priest, and I'm very hesitant to impose myself
Yeah,
on people in any way, let alone my religion. Well, especially my religion. I'm certainly willing to impose myself on good books I read or good films I've seen, but something more fundamental, like you know um, what is valuable to me in life, like fundamentally, and um, what is meaningful to me in life. I don't want to assume that other people would find meaning in that, such as my faith. So it's really, in this series is a way just to, the books are like Mary Jo Leddy's Why Are We Here? It's not meant to impose, but it's an invitation to reflect upon, and maybe other people are having the same question, mulling the same question in these times as they read the newspapers about, yeah, about our sovereignty. And, so it's like, I always try to keep it invitational. It's,
I have one little
there we
story
go.
about my mother. My mother used to, people would come and sit in her kitchen, and one of these elderly men from the reserve was telling her, why do the priests tell us that we can't go and worship God in the Sundance? you
Mhm.
know so he was agonizing over that, but then he said, you know what they do, they put us in this little cup and they expect us to be happy. And he was talking about the government and having to
Mm,
stay on the reserve and not having access beyond that.
mhm,
So I heard his pain.
mhm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Reed, I don't know if you had anything, a question or.
Sure. So hi everyone.
Hi,
I've been
Reed.
lurking in the comments. I've been very attentive. So I'm actually baking bread.
Oh, nice.
So I have students who come to my class and they're crocheting, and it's a way. One thing that I've learned is that if I just because I don't know, ADHD or something, if I sit in front of a computer and try to pay attention to what's happening, I often miss a lot of it. My attention wanders or whatever. Whereas if I do something, I actually catch it all. And so I've really been very, except for when we lost power and I was disconnected. But so I had a comment and a question. Kathleen, I was very struck by what you were saying about the students that would come to you and say, "How do you be Canadian?" And so I thought so I've been there. I'm actually not. So when you said, Stephen, remember something where a place you grew up in Canada. I didn't grow up in Canada. I'm from the States originally. Um, but I've lived here now for 20 years, which is longer than I've lived anywhere because we moved around when I was young. Um, and one of the things that sort of reminded me, I guess I didn't need to be reminded, but when I first arrived here, one of the things that reminded me about sort of racialized politics in Canada was that when I started teaching, students assumed that I was Canadian, right? And a lot of my students looked very differently than I do. And I would always try to point out to them that they'd been Canadian a lot longer than I had. They were much more representative of Canada than I was. Um, and so that was the story. But I guess, I mean, um, so I was being a little shy because I haven't read the book. I read two of Mary Jo Leddy's other books, so I have a pretty good sense of how she sort of builds her arguments, and so I wasn't surprised by anything you said, Stephen. But I had a question. So I mean, Trevor, I think that you asked the question, have we missed the chance? Have we missed the chance? And I wonder about that. So there are two questions about that. The first one is that aren't we always going to miss the chance when we're comfortable?
Mm.
Right? Isn't it always going to be in some crisis that that we claim something or don't, right? I mean, I think there's a real question there. But the second one is that, you know, it is interesting because I think this is probably the first opportunity that Canada has had to rethink its understanding as a middle power.
Mm.
You know, when I was a kid, or even when I first arrived here, that was still very much the way that Canada regarded itself. Um, and yeah, and so I just wanted to ask about that, right? I mean, that's kind of a narrow way to think, but at the time it was, you know, Canada was in a good company, right? It was in the company of India and it was in the company of lots of other countries. And that just doesn't make any sense anymore. And I'm not saying that the only way we would understand ourselves is internationally, and that's certainly not what Mary Jo Leddy is working on. But I'm just wondering if there are thoughts about that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Reed. And I can almost smell the bread here. It's I'm like really appetizing. I'm so glad you're doing that. You know, I remember in the 70s and 80s, the role of Canada as peacekeeper, as a power that, as you're suggesting, you know, had a role, not as a superpower, but as a peacekeeper, as a peacemaker. And I think of Lester Bowles Pearson. You know, I'm right here at Emmanuel College, Victoria University, where he was, and just walk through the Peace Garden that is in part dedicated to him. And I think of that role of Canada as being a advocate for peace and tolerance and respect on the global stage. And the kind of peace, order, and good government that define part of the Canadian identity in terms of governance being perhaps revisited now, that this might be a moment where those kind of middle power attributes might be reclaimed and re-examined. I remember one comic, stand-up comic, talking about the relationship between Canada and the United States. And he said, you know, Canada is like the designated driver for the United States. It gets drunk and it starts going, okay, time to go home, buddy. You know, like you've had enough, you know. Influencing the United States in that way as a kind of sober neighbor. And that could still happen in the future. But I think that this is also now, and I'm really open to and very interested in what others think here, but I think this is a moment of nation building for Canada, as it has to reflect on its close ties with the United States since the signing of the Free Trade Accord, and how that has in many ways shaped our imaginations. You know, maybe colonized, I don't know, that might be, but certainly shaped our imaginations and shaped our cultural patterns. I mean, I do remember Sunday being a totally closed shopping day here in Toronto, and everything closed except for used bookstores and an occasional convenience store. And I kind of liked it, you know, because it was calm, it was quiet. Now at the Loblaws in my neighborhood, they say it's the busiest shopping day is Sunday. You know? And the argument was, well, the Americans are doing Sunday shopping. We've got to do it on the cross-border, you know, that was lost to us. But I'm wondering if this might be a time too, where Canada reflects on its own need to build whatever keeps us together as a country. So for example, there was a CBC article yesterday or the day before talking about mega projects like the high-speed rail between Quebec City and Windsor that has been on hold for at least 20 years with 14 different reports. Now that the Trudeau government just passed, but Trudeau had said, we're going to make this a priority. The reflection is projects like that might go forward now because there's a larger wind in the sails. This is now our country. We're not going to rely on, second brand, second that branch plant status, as Mary Jo talks about. Like, we have to take ownership of our own infrastructure. We have to take ownership of our own future. We have to protect and cultivate that which strengthens and unites us as a nation. Not just defining against the United States or any other place, as Mary Jo said, but what do we value? And not wait for someone else to do it. Actually, we might do. So there is a new kind of impetus to do a kind of nation building and, not have the kind of rotten infrastructure and decaying housing crisis and the homelessness crisis that we've allowed to happen. This was not the Canadian way. And so I remember loving the lyrics in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s of American Woman by the Winnipeg band, the Guess Who, I don't want you ghetto scenes. I don't want your war machines. Colored lights can hypnotize, sparkle someone else's eyes. American Woman, get away from me. Like that kind of America we don't want. It's time for us to assert what we do want. And with this rupture in the free trade accord and this kind of belligerence from the United States, or at least from the Trump administration, there might be a new moment for that kind of thinking and infrastructure building and reimagining in Canada.
And I think the timing is so amazing. One would hope we had been further along, but to have Wabkanu to have a kind of a principal role in many of the discussions and to hear his stories on social media is quite a delight. And we have gone through learning with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we have the voice of the Honorable Murray Sinclair, and we have a lot of powerful Indigenous voices, whereas 30 years ago they would have been silenced, I think. And so I'm just, in lots of ways, I think it's a good time for us to have this conversation.
And if I could add too, it was, we may be on the cusp of finding our true place. And, and Stephen, and my question, are we in the process of losing it before we found it? But I do agree with you, Stephen, that I think it is like a quote unquote opportunity where we've never been more united that I can ever remember. Now we'll see how long that lasts. It's a lot has happened in just only a few weeks, but I think up until a couple of months ago, despite all of our regional divisions, sovereignty was in Quebec was on the rise a little bit. We were as Canadians for decades, in a place of complacency, of contentment. We kind of had our place in the world. We felt protected by and large, largely because of our relationship with the United States, of course, but our being part of NATO and so on. And up until recently, we've been kind of shoved off that ledge, I guess you can say. We can no longer be complacent or content, even despite our divisions. And the image that comes to mind is the disciples, when Jesus invites the disciples on the mountain in his transfiguration. And they like what they see, and they want to stay on that. They want to stay in that place. And Jesus is saying, this is not your place. That's this I'm asking you to leave the mountain while you're alive in this our lifetime, to go out amongst the people and enter into that very gray zone of not knowing where you're going to be led, the situations you're going to find yourselves in. But that's what I want you to do for the greater good of the kingdom. But the kingdom is not this mountain. It's not this place. And I think in a kind of a way, and I'm just articulating this now to myself, we are being called off our mountain of contentment and complacency. And it's very scary, as it was for the disciples. But in that going forth, there's tremendous opportunity. I kind of feel energized in a kind of a way, although very, very scary. But I think we wouldn't be on the cusp of finding our true place, I don't think, without this kind of disruption of being asked to go in a new direction. And I think, I think it's.
Yeah, I really
I was
appreciate.
just gonna say- oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Reed, please.
I was just gonna say, I love the image of the mountain. That's great. Thank you, Trevor.
Me too.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same, and also what a contrast to the American image of the city on the hill, which has been an American metaphor. Up there, a beacon to the world, the city on the hill, which has certain triumphalistic overtones, and going off the mountain, being among the people, following the spirit, like the ancient Israelites with a wisp of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. This isn't a pilgrim church, it's a nomad church. It's finding the spirit. You don't always know where you're going, but you are there not in triumphalistic glory, but in kind of humble listening and following and supporting and serving. So I really like that, Trevor, and it circles back to the Christian dimensions of Mary Jo's work here. I remember her at the Catholic New Times interviewing Jean Chrétien. I forget what his role was at the time, but he talked about his Christianity, and my name is Christian, and this is serious for me. I mean, I take my Christianity seriously. And, I think that I don't remember all the ins and outs of the interview, but I remember being struck reading it that here, it was a prominent cabinet member. It was before he was prime minister. I think Trudeau was still the prime minister at the time, Pierre Trudeau. But he was talking about the role of the Christian values in what he was trying to do and what Canada was trying to do on the international stage, of bringing peace, of respect, of tolerance, and of recognizing and respecting treaties, agreements. So this might be another moment of reflecting on what are our spiritual values now, and how might they infiltrate, influence, permeate our commonweal and our political practice. As we just had an election here in Ontario for provincial parliament, and Mr. Ford was reelected. But a good news story for me was a former student, Alexa Gilmore, who is a United Church minister, an environmental studies student from U of T, who also is a good friend of Mary Jo Leddy, who, as minister of Windermere United Church, got a call from Mary Jo. I think it was just 6 months into her ministry there. And Mary Jo, right before Christmas, said, "Look, I have a Roma family. They're going to be deported, and they'll probably be beaten or killed or imprisoned if they go back home. Can you offer them sanctuary?" And Alexa said, "Let me talk to my congregation and I'll get back to you tomorrow." And she spoke to the congregation and they said, yes. She called Mary Jo back and she said, "Thank you, Alexa. I called 20 other churches and they all said we were too busy because of Christmas to take Joseph, his wife, and a little child."
Oh,
No room in the inn.
No room in the inn. Alexa took them in, the Pasuma family. She kept them in sanctuary. They couldn't go outside. The daughter could go out. under guard from the members of the congregation, so she wouldn't be picked up by immigration. And then, thankfully, in my view, the Harper government fell, and the Liberal government came in, and the member of parliament for her riding, Varani, pushed through landing permanent resident status for the Pasuma family, and came to Alexa's congregation and said, "Thank you, Alexa, and your congregation for holding up the Canadian values when they were being betrayed."
Mm.
She was just elected member of provincial parliament for the NDP in Parkdale High Park. And she brings this love of the earth and this love of the refugee and the homeless and the despondent into Queen's Park. That gives me hope that these values that have always circulated through Canadian politics, through the CCF, et cetera, the Tommy Douglas Christian origins, are also now making a space. And at her victory party, I was talking to a wonderful gentleman, Mr. Thunderbird, a young Indigenous man who was part of the selection committee for the NDP candidacy in that riding. And he said there was opposition among my people because she had Reverend in front of her name. And I said, look at what she's done. Look how she's cared for refugees and homeless and people who were on the street. Look how she's cared for them. I support her. And she got the support of that community. So that gives me hope that these values are coming through into our political spaces through elected officials who bring them, in this case, a direct connection to Mary Jo Leddy and what she believes in now in Queen's Park. And the first course she took with me was Liberation Cosmologies, the theology of Gustavo Gutierrez and the work of Thomas Berry, and the new cosmology and the liberation.
I think I am meant to connect with Alexa because Simon Apolloni was just telling me about her yesterday and said I should connect with
Yes,
her.
you mentioned that. That's right. That's right.
Sister
Yep.
Mary.
I raised my hand just to say thank you to all of you for all that you've shared. I must leave right now, but this has been very, very special. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Marianne. Great to see you. Blessings. Bye now.
I don't know if there are any other final thoughts before we conclude.
I have one attempt at humor, Trevor, if I may, because sometimes it can get depressing, some of this stuff. So, okay. What did the frustrated grandmother do when she saw all three of her grandchildren on their iPads? She left them to their own devices.
Good one.
That's original.
That's a new one.
That's the original one, yeah.
Yeah.
Most of them stink.
Very good. Yeah, it's good to it's a heavy topic, so we got to break the ice a little bit. But thank you so much, Stephen. We're a small group, and I suspected we would be a little small, but I suspect a lot of people will be going to the recording. That's usually what happens as well. So, and
Trevor, can I share the recording with my elderly aunt who is part of Development and Peace? And I wish she was here with us.
yeah, so yeah, that's the idea. So we'll have it on our website. What we do is Stan will send out a kind of an email to everyone, thanking everyone for that, everyone who has registered, and he'll have a link to the recording.
Okay, great.
In that email. Yeah, it may be about a week because he's away because of March break. But yeah, so that will be ready. And it's just we have you're on our email list, so we have other reading forums coming up. The next one is The Hidden Life of Trees, but the graphic version. Now, but it's the graphic version, not this, but it's the graphic version. And Simon Apolloni will join us who also teaches at the School of Environment at U of T, to kind of break that open for us. but I'm really glad for a rich discussion amongst us. It's kind of our own small group. So that's really wonderful, and for all your input. And thank you again, Stephen, for you were supposed to be partnering with Mary Jo. You stepped in.
Oh, no, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Great to meet you all. Great to see you, Reed. Yeah,
guys
Yeah.
have inspired me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
great to
Bye.
be. Well, blessings on you all. Okay.
Blessings.
Blessings. Bye-bye.
I'll
Bye now. Enjoy the sun.
Yeah.